The wind that rolled across the Wyoming plains carried a dry whisper, the kind that clung to the dust and told stories of forgotten souls. The sun had slipped low, bleeding orange across the open land, where fences stood crooked and creaking like tired old men. Somewhere in that endless stretch of earth and sky, a rancher named Clay Turner was riding home when he first heard about the Chinese widow's daughter. Folks in town said she'd never spoken a word since her father's death 5 years ago, not even to her mother. Some said she was cursed. Others said she'd simply seen too much to ever speak again. Clay wasn't one to feed on rumors, but there was something in the way people whispered her story, quiet and uneasy, that caught in his mind. He'd been around enough silence to know it wasn't always peace. Sometimes, silence hid things that words couldn't carry. That night he rode back to his ranch with the image of a small figure standing in a doorway, dark eyes watching a world that had long turned its back on her. The town of Willow Bend wasn't much more than a cluster of weathered buildings pressed against a river that sometimes dried before summer's end. Still, it had its gossip, its old rivalries, and its wounds. Most folks came there chasing something, land, freedom, or forgiveness, but stayed because leaving took more strength than they had left. At the far edge of town sat an abandoned mill road that curved into the foothills. Beyond that was the old Chang property, where the widow and her daughter lived alone, tending a patch of earth that refused to grow anything but weeds. The widow, known only as May, had come west with her husband during the railroad days. He was a strong man, folks said, worked the line until the explosion that took his life, and left her a stranger in a place that tolerated her only because it had to. After his death, she'd turned inward, speaking to no one except the shopkeeper once a month when she bought rice and tea. Her daughter followed her example, never saying a word, only nodding when spoken to. She'd been maybe 7 when her father died, and no one could remember hearing her voice even before that. Clay hadn't thought much of them until the drought came. The summer was merciless, the creeks shrunk to mud, and cattle were dying faster than men could dig holes. He'd been fixing a fence near the foothills when he saw smoke rising from the direction of the Chang place. Thinking it might be a wildfire, he rode over. But what he found was no fire, just the girl, now nearly grown, standing beside a broken water barrel, her small hands clutching a wooden dipper, her bare feet dusty and cracked. She looked straight at him, calm but unreadable, as if she'd been expecting him. He dismounted, tipped his hat, and tried to offer a few words about the weather, but she said nothing, not even a blink. It was the kind of silence that made the air heavier. Behind her, the little farmhouse leaned against the wind, its windows dark. Clay noticed the broken latch on the door and a faint sound from inside, like a groan or a sob. But before he could ask, the girl turned and disappeared indoors. That evening, he couldn't shake the image of her eyes. They weren't blank like the eyes of a frightened child. They were knowing, as if she carried something she'd sworn never to tell. The next day, Clay stopped by the general store. The talk had already spread. Someone had heard the widow was sick, that she hadn't been seen in days. Old Mrs. Riley, who ran the store, leaned over the counter and lowered her voice. "That child, Clay. They say she don't talk because she saw what really happened to her daddy. Not an accident like the papers said. Some folks think the company men silenced her family for good measure." She paused, eyes darting toward the dusty window. "I tell you, there's something strange up there. At night you can see a lantern moving along the ridge. No one else lives near enough for it to be anyone else." Clay brushed it off, though the words sank deeper than he cared to admit. He'd seen plenty of lies buried under polite conversation in his life, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way the town avoided that stretch of land, pretending it didn't exist. Maybe it was the girl's eyes. Later that week, a storm rolled in from the west, heavy with thunder that never quite broke. Clay saddled up to check his cattle before the rain hit. When he reached the far pasture, he saw something small moving near the fence line, someone walking alone through the darkening field. He urged his horse closer and realized it was her, the widow's daughter, soaked and barefoot, clutching something against her chest. He called out, but she didn't turn. When he caught up, he saw what she held, a torn piece of paper wrapped around a rusted pocket watch. Her hands trembled as if she didn't know whether to hide it or hand it over. She didn't speak, but her eyes met his, pleading without sound. Then she took off running toward the trees. Clay hesitated only a moment before following. The rain came hard, blurring everything. He found her standing near the mouth of an old mine shaft, the same one the company had sealed after the explosion that killed her father. The wooden boards over the entrance had been pulled away. She knelt beside the opening, set the watch on a stone, and pressed her hand to the earth, as if she were listening for something beneath it. When Clay called again, she turned, and for the first time he thought she might try to speak. Her lips parted, but instead of words, a broken breath escaped, raw and painful. Then she pointed, slowly, deliberately, toward the darkness of the mine. He understood enough to know there was something buried down there, something she wanted the world to see. The storm eased before dawn. By morning the girl was gone. Only the watch remained, and when Clay opened it, he saw an engraving inside. 2 Chinese characters and a date scratched faintly beneath. The date matched the day the mine collapsed, and behind that, a second etching, faint and jagged. Not an English word, but a symbol, one Clay didn't recognize until much later. When he rode into town to ask about it, the sheriff gave him a long, measured look. "You best leave that business alone, Clay," he said quietly. Some truths around here were buried for good reason, but Clay wasn't built for ignoring ghosts. The more he asked, the more people shut their doors. Even the preacher avoided his eye at Sunday service. The town that had always been tight-knit suddenly felt hollow. It was as if the girl's silence had spread, swallowing everyone whole. That night, Clay dreamed of the mine again, of voices echoing deep underground, and of a lantern flickering far below, carried by a hand too small to belong to a grown man. He woke with the uneasy sense that someone had been standing outside his window. By morning his hunch was confirmed. Fresh footprints, bare and narrow, led from the edge of his porch toward the barn. Inside, he found her again, crouched in the shadows, pale and shivering. She didn't flinch when he approached this time. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, he saw a small piece of wood, burned around the edges, carved with the same strange symbol from the watch. She pointed again, this time toward the horizon, where the old company camp had once stood before it burned to the ground. Clay felt the weight of something shift inside him. Whatever she'd carried all these years, it wasn't madness or fear. It was truth, ugly, buried truth. And now it was reaching the surface through her silence. He looked at her then, this girl who had never spoken, and realized the whole town had been listening wrong. Her silence wasn't absence. It was protection. As the first light crept across the plains, she turned toward the east, where the mine mouth still yawned dark and waiting. She took one step forward, then another, never looking back. Clay followed her, his boots sinking in the wet earth, knowing there was no turning away now. Whatever they found buried beneath that ground wasn't just her story anymore. It was the town's, and before the day ended, someone was going to speak, whether they wanted to or not. The morning light came soft and thin across the land, stretching long shadows from the cottonwoods near the creek. Clay followed the girl as she walked toward the old mine road, her steps slow but sure, like she'd made this walk 100 times before. The air still carried the damp smell of the storm. Every now and then she looked back, making sure he was still behind her. She hadn't said a word, but something about her silence spoke louder than any voice could have. Clay's horse followed quietly, hooves sinking into the soft earth. He didn't know what he expected to find, only that the girl's eyes told him she wasn't leading him on some wild chase. There was purpose in every move she made. When they reached the clearing near the base of the hills, the ground was littered with rusted rails, splintered beams, and the remains of an old company sign half buried in mud. The mine entrance loomed just ahead, its wooden supports rotted and blackened by time. The girl stopped a few feet from the mouth of the shaft and pointed to the ground. Clay crouched beside her and saw something barely visible beneath a thin layer of dirt, an old metal tag, the kind miners used to wear around their necks. He brushed the soil away, revealing the number 47 stamped into the steel. Beneath that, faint Chinese characters were etched by hand. "Your father?" Clay asked softly. She didn't answer, but her eyes dropped toward the ground. And that was enough. Clay had worked with railroad men before, some of them Chinese, some Irish, all of them tough and poor, doing what they had to for $1. He remembered how the company treated them like tools, not people. When accidents happened, no one asked questions. There were no graves, no markers, just stories swallowed by the wind. Looking at the girl now, he realized she was living proof of one of those forgotten stories. She picked up a stone and traced a circle in the dirt beside the mine entrance. Inside it, she drew that same strange symbol he'd seen on the pocket watch and the carved wood. It looked almost like a bird in flight, but its wings were uneven, jagged, as if cut short. Then she looked up at him, her face calm but full of something deeper. Pain, maybe, or determination. Clay nodded slowly, unsure what she wanted from him but willing to follow where it led. He reached for the lantern hanging from his saddle and struck a match. The flame flickered weakly in the damp air. When he stepped closer to the entrance, a rush of cold wind poured out, carrying the stale breath of the mine. Inside, the walls were black with soot, the air thick and damp. Clay lifted the lantern higher. Wooden beams groaned softly above him. He could hear the girl's footsteps behind him, light and steady. About 20 yards in, the tunnel split. The right passage was caved in, but the left still stretched open into darkness. "Don't go further," he said quietly, turning to face her. "This place ain't safe." She shook her head and pointed toward the left tunnel. Clay hesitated, but something in her gaze urged him on. He moved ahead a few steps, the lantern light trembling against the rock walls. Then he saw it. Faint scratches on the stone, like someone had clawed at the surface long ago. Words in a language he couldn't read, carved by desperate hands. He ran his fingers over the marks and turned to the girl. Her expression didn't change, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and touched one of the carvings. For the first time, he saw tears in her eyes. She wiped them quickly and stepped back, shaking her head as if to say, "Not yet. Not here." Clay led her out into the daylight again. She stood there breathing hard, her face pale. He offered her his canteen, and she took it, sipping slowly before handing it back. "Your father died here," Clay said, more as a statement than a question. "But it wasn't just an accident, was it?" She lowered her eyes. Then, to his surprise, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside were several folded papers, yellowed and brittle. She handed them to him. Clay opened one carefully. It was a letter written in shaky English, signed by someone named Li Wen, her father. The letter spoke of unsafe tunnels, unpaid wages, and a warning to the company overseer that the supports would give way. It ended abruptly, as if he'd never finished writing. Clay folded the paper and stared at the mine. "They knew," he murmured. "They knew it wasn't safe, and they sent him in anyway." The girl looked toward the hills, her eyes distant. He understood then that she had been carrying the truth all along, waiting for someone willing to listen. Back in town, Clay tried to show the letter to the sheriff, but the man barely glanced at it. "You think I don't know how that mine business went?" the sheriff said coldly. "Half this town was built off that company's money. Best you burn that letter and let the past lie quiet." Clay left without another word, his anger burning low and steady. He wasn't the kind to pick fights with ghosts, but this felt different. The girl hadn't asked for his help, yet she'd trusted him enough to show him what she'd hidden all her life. He couldn't turn away from that. That night, Clay rode back to his ranch. The wind had picked up again, stirring the grass in restless waves. He saw a light flickering near his barn and drew his gun, but when he stepped closer, he saw the girl standing there again, holding the lantern. Her dress was torn, her hair loose around her face. She raised her hand and pointed toward the town. Then she reached into her pocket and handed him another folded paper. Inside was a photograph, faded and cracked at the edges. It showed a group of men standing in front of the mine, their faces serious. Clay recognized Li Wen from the letter, standing near the center. But what caught his eye was the man beside him. It was the same company overseer whose portrait still hung in the town hall. He looked up at the girl. "You're saying he caused it?" She nodded once, firmly. Clay stared at the picture again. The overseer had been praised for his leadership after the explosion, rewarded with land and wealth. The town had honored him every year since. If what she was saying was true, everything they believed about that mine disaster was a lie. He thought of the sheriff's warning, of the old townsfolk who still refused to speak of that day. Maybe they all knew. Maybe they'd known all along. Over the next few days, Clay couldn't focus on his work. The letter, the watch, the photograph, they all stayed in his pocket, heavy reminders of something he couldn't ignore. He started asking quiet questions, talking to men who'd worked on the railroad years before. Most shut their doors on him, but one old miner living out by the ridge finally told him what he wanted to know. They sealed that mine too fast, the man said. Said it was for safety, but there were still men trapped inside. The overseer ordered it closed before we could dig them out, claimed the ground was too unstable. But it wasn't. They just didn't want the truth to come out, that the company cut corners on the timber braces. Clay listened in silence, his hands clenched. "And the widow's husband?" he asked. The old miner nodded. He tried to warn them. They didn't listen. When the shaft went, he was right at the heart of it. Some of us tried to dig through, but they stopped us, told us to leave it be. When Clay rode back to his ranch that evening, the sun was sinking behind the hills. He saw the girl again, waiting by the fence. This time she carried the wooden carving with the symbol on it. She handed it to him, then touched her hand to her chest, over her heart. He realized it wasn't just a mark, it was a family emblem, something her father had carved long ago. Clay felt the truth pressing closer now, like the earth itself was trying to breathe again after years of being buried. The girl had lived in silence, carrying her father's story because no one else would. But something still didn't fit. There was fear in her eyes, the kind that didn't come from grief alone. She kept glancing toward the hills as if someone, or something, was watching. That night, long after she left, Clay sat on his porch staring at the dark horizon. The wind carried faint sounds, metal clinking, wood creaking, like echoes from the mine. He told himself it was just the wind. But when he looked down at the carving in his hand, he noticed something new. On the back, faint but clear, were more words scratched into the wood in English. "They buried more than men." The word sent a chill through him. He rose slowly, his breath catching. Whatever lay beneath that mine wasn't just the truth about an accident. It was something deeper, something the whole town had chosen to forget. And the girl, she was the last link to it. The silence she carried was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who'd lived under the shadow of that hill. And before long, Clay knew, that silence would have to break. The days that followed were heavy with a tension Clay couldn't shake. Every time he rode past the edge of town, he noticed the subtle changes. The way doors were latched tighter, windows shuttered earlier, and voices dropped when he entered a room. People whispered behind their hands, giving him hurried glances before returning to their chores as if nothing had happened. Clay felt the weight of suspicion like a stone in his pocket, and he knew the girl's secret had begun stirring more than just his curiosity. He returned often to the mine entrance, each time finding new signs that someone, or something, had been there. Footprints pressed deep into the mud, though no horse or human had passed. A rusted lantern, long unused, lay overturned in the dirt, and the faint scent of smoke lingered, as if someone had tried to burn a message that didn't want to be hidden. Clay kept the girl's carved wood and the papers close to him, studying them in the quiet of his barn. He traced the symbols, the dates, and the warnings, feeling a connection that went deeper than fear. These weren't just relics. They were cries for justice long ignored. Meanwhile, the girl became a constant presence in his thoughts. Clay began to notice small details he hadn't before. The way her hands moved when she tended the horses, careful and precise. The way she paused at certain spots along the fence, as if she remembered something hidden. And how her eyes could hold his gaze without blinking, demanding understanding without a single sound. She seemed older than her years, shaped by grief and endurance that the town could never comprehend. But not everyone in Willow Bend saw her in the same way. Mrs. Riley, the shopkeeper, had been watching him from her counter for weeks, suspicion etched across her face. "You don't want to go digging around that girl's past, Clay," she warned quietly one morning as he bought coffee. "There's more to that family than you know. And some of it people died to keep quiet." Clay nodded without replying, the coffee warm in his hands but not warming the unease that had grown inside him. He had already seen enough to know that truth was dangerous. It had a way of spreading like wildfire, and once it touched the wrong ears, there was no stopping it. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he couldn't help thinking about the company overseer from the photograph, the man whose face still hung proudly in the town hall. If what the girl had shown him was true, then the very foundation of Willow Bend's history was built on lies and silent suffering. Clay couldn't ignore that, not when the girl's quiet trust had given him a glimpse of the reality behind the story. One evening, Clay rode to the edge of the hills, drawn again to the mine entrance. The sky was bruised with clouds, and the wind carried a sharp chill. When he arrived, the girl was there, kneeling in the mud, lantern at her side. She didn't speak, but she held up another item, a rusted key on a leather thong. Clay took it carefully, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm. He examined the key and realized it was old, likely part of the mine's original locks. But what caught his attention was the small engraving near the ring, a set of initials matching the overseer's name. The implication was clear. Someone wanted the truth locked away, and this key was a clue to where it had been hidden. Clay tried to follow her as she led him along the ridge, but she moved faster than he expected. They stopped near a small forgotten cabin, barely standing among twisted trees. The walls were scorched, the roof sagging. Inside, faint traces of smoke and burned papers suggested someone had been there not long ago. Clay's stomach tightened. Whoever had tried to destroy this place had known exactly what they were after. He stepped carefully over the broken threshold and saw fragments of documents scattered across the dirt floor. Some were maps, others lists of workers' names, and a few were letters, all with portions burned or torn. Clay recognized the overseer's handwriting on some of them, orders sent to the foreman, warnings ignored, and payments withheld. Outside, the girl's eyes scanned the hills, alert and restless. Clay realized she had been watching more than just the mine. She was aware of everyone in town, of every footstep on the ridge, of every shadow that might betray a secret. Her silence was a shield, her way of surviving in a place that had treated her family with cruelty and neglect. Over the next few days, Clay began questioning others, carefully, watching their reactions. An older man who'd worked as a foreman for the railroad seemed uneasy when Clay mentioned the mine. His hands shook as he passed a cup of water, and he mumbled something about the company's orders before hurrying out. Another man, younger and brash, laughed off the story, saying, "You're chasing ghosts, Turner. That mine's been closed longer than half the town's been alive." But Clay noticed the way his eyes flicked to the ridge when he spoke, a fleeting shadow of fear in the man's gaze. Meanwhile, the girl stayed nearby, always present but never speaking. She would sit quietly on the porch of Clay's barn, her gaze fixed on the horizon, or follow him silently as he checked fences and cattle. Occasionally, she'd reach into her pocket and pull out a small piece of paper with symbols or numbers, handing it to him. Clay began piecing them together, a rough map of the mine, notes about hidden shafts, and lists of names that hadn't been accounted for after the collapse. Then, one night, the tension in town reached a breaking point. A fire broke out at the overseer's old property, long abandoned, but still held in the memories of the townsfolk. Flames leapt across the dry grass, and people gathered at a distance, whispering rumors of revenge, secrets, and justice long delayed. Clay rode toward the blaze, but the girl held him back with a quiet hand on his arm. Her eyes were fierce, warning him not to act recklessly. He realized then that she was not only a keeper of secrets, but a strategist of survival. Every move she made had purpose, every silence a message. The townspeople's fear wasn't only about the past, it was about what could be uncovered if the girl's story came to light. At the same time, Clay felt an internal struggle. He wanted to protect the girl, to shield her from the dangers that lurked behind every whispered rumor, every darkened doorway. But he also knew that shielding her meant leaving the truth buried, letting injustice stand. He couldn't do that. And yet, every step toward exposing the past made him wonder how far the town, and those still loyal to the company, would go to protect their secrets. Over the next week, Clay discovered more fragments of the story. A journal hidden under a loose floorboard in the old cabin revealed the overseer's true role. He had been ruthless, enforcing dangerous work practices, silencing those who complained, and covering up the deaths of several men, including Li Wen. The girl had witnessed it all as a child, her memory sharp and unyielding, yet she had chosen silence, carrying the burden alone. Clay also began noticing a pattern in the townsfolk's behavior. Some avoided him entirely, others followed at a distance, and a few whispered threats when he wasn't looking. The tension was building not just because of what had happened decades ago, but because the girl's presence reminded everyone that the past had not been forgiven, and it had not been forgotten. One evening, as Clay sat by the fire in his barn, the girl brought him another item, a small box, locked, with the same jagged symbol carved into its lid. She placed it gently at his feet, then stepped back. He looked into her eyes, searching for an answer, a word, anything. But there was nothing. Only the same quiet determination. He tried the key from the wooden carving in the box, and it turned with a soft click. Inside were more papers, a photograph of men working in the mine, and what appeared to be a ledger detailing payments and bribes. One page had a name crossed out, Li Wen. Next to it was a note in the overseer's handwriting, "Ensure no one remembers him." Clay felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had stumbled into something far bigger than a personal story of grief. It was a network of lies and cover-ups, a system that had robbed men of their lives and a child of her voice. The girl had carried this alone for years, and now that he was involved, he knew danger would follow them both. The nights grew restless, filled with shadows and whispers in the wind. Clay heard creaking boards outside his window, footsteps in the barn, and the faint glint of lanterns on the ridge. Someone was watching, waiting. And with every passing day, it became clear that the town itself held its breath, uncertain who would move next, who would speak, and who would silence the truth forever. The girl, silent but unyielding, had become the center of the storm. And Clay realized that uncovering the past meant walking into the heart of it, a place where fear, loyalty, and vengeance were tangled like roots under the earth. He looked at her then, holding the ledger and the papers, the flickering lantern casting shadows across her face. The wind carried a low whistle through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of the old mine groaning, as if echoing the town's buried guilt. Clay knew one thing for certain: the girl's silence had lasted long enough, and soon, whether they were ready or not, the truth would speak. But at that moment, standing on the ridge with the dark hills behind them, he didn't yet know who would hear it first, or what price they would pay to uncover it. Clay woke before dawn, the cold creeping under the edges of his blanket. The barn was quiet, except for the low hum of the wind threading through the cracks in the wood. The girl was already gone. He found her by the edge of the creek, crouched on her knees, hands hovering over the water, as if she were listening to something beneath the surface. The lantern she held flickered, casting elongated shadows across her face. Her eyes caught his, steady and unreadable, and he felt the weight of her purpose pressing against him. "You're moving faster than I can keep up," Clay said softly, trying not to startle her. She didn't answer. She never had, not with words. But there was a sense of urgency in the way she stood, then turned toward the hills, urging him silently to follow. They rode toward the mine, the air heavy with moisture and anticipation. The trail was slick from recent rains, and Clay's horse slipped once on the mud. The girl reached out and steadied him, her touch quick but deliberate. He realized she had memorized every inch of this terrain, every hidden rock and broken fence, like the land itself was part of her memory. As they approached the mine, the tension became almost physical. Broken beams littered the entrance, the wood splintered and darkened with age. The wind sighed through the opening, carrying the faint odor of wet earth and something older, metal, decay, and the faint trace of smoke from long ago. Clay gripped the lantern tighter. He could hear his own heartbeat, thudding louder than any sound of the night. Inside, the air was dense, almost suffocating. Clay's boots crunched over the rubble, and the girl moved beside him, small and silent, holding her lantern close. They came to the left tunnel where the earlier scratches had marked the walls. The symbols were sharper now, more frantic, as if someone had been in a hurry to leave a message before disappearing. The girl traced her finger over one of the etchings. Her hand shook slightly, and for the first time, Clay saw her eyes widen in something akin to fear. "What is it?" he whispered. She shook her head but pressed on, deeper into the tunnel. The darkness thickened, swallowing the light from the lantern. The air smelled of damp stone and something metallic, a faint underlying scent of blood long dried but still remembered by the walls. Suddenly, the ground beneath Clay's horse shifted. A section of the floor had rotted away, revealing a narrow drop into a shaft below. He braced himself, feeling the thin rope of fear tighten around his chest. The girl stepped over the edge with a careful grace that made his heart hammer. She stopped a few feet ahead, kneeling near another set of carved symbols that seemed fresher, as though someone had been there recently. Clay followed, careful with each step. The symbols told a story of warnings, names, and dates. The mind's dark history pressed into the walls like an accusation. And then, in the faint glow of the lantern, he saw the first sign that someone else had been watching. Footprints pressed into the dirt, too fresh to belong to the girl or to any animals. Someone had been here before them, waiting, perhaps, to make sure these secrets stayed buried. The girl pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, unfolded it, and held it against the wall. On it were notes, crude maps, and names. The same ones Clay had seen before, but arranged differently, pointing toward an area deeper in the shaft. She gestured, insisting he follow her, and he did, stepping over broken beams and avoiding loose stones. Every sound echoed, every movement magnified. Clay felt the presence of someone else in the mine, though he couldn't see them. They reached a narrow passage, barely wide enough to squeeze through. The walls here were blackened with smoke, and the air grew colder, sharper. The girl pressed the wooden carving to the wall, the jagged symbol glowing faintly in the lantern light. Clay noticed a faint draft, and then the smell hit him. Metallic, sharp, unmistakable. Blood. Not fresh, but enough to make his stomach twist. At the far end of the passage was a small chamber, half collapsed but still intact. Wooden supports groaned under the weight of the earth above. Inside, crates were stacked haphazardly, dust thick and undisturbed for decades. On one crate, the girl set the lantern down and reached for another small pouch. Inside were papers, photographs, and a journal bound in cracked leather. Clay picked it up, recognizing the handwriting instantly. It was Lee Wen's, detailed accounts of the mine, warnings ignored, workers exploited, and threats made against anyone who dared speak. Clay's heart pounded. He had known the truth was terrible, but seeing it laid bare in Lee Wen's own hand made it visceral. The girl knelt beside him, eyes scanning each page, her hands trembling slightly. Then she held up a folded sheet that seemed different from the rest. The paper was water-stained but intact, with a map marking a location deeper in the mine, labeled simply, "The place they hid him." Clay swallowed hard. "Him?" he asked, voice rough. She nodded, pointing to the markings. He understood immediately. Someone, maybe more than one, had been trapped or hidden here when the mine collapsed, their lives erased so the overseer could maintain his reputation. The ground trembled slightly beneath them, a warning or a threat. Clay's hand went to his gun. "We're not alone," he whispered. She didn't respond, but she clutched the carving tighter, as if drawing courage from it. Suddenly a noise came from behind, a creak, followed by a shuffle. Clay spun, lantern held high, and caught the faint silhouette of someone moving among the shadows. He called out, but there was no answer, only the echo of the wind and the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the deeper tunnels. The girl's hand shot up, pointing further in. It was as if she knew the path that had been traveled, the secrets waiting to be uncovered, even without words. Clay followed, heart hammering, each step heavier than the last. The passage narrowed, forcing them to move single file. The air grew colder, damp and biting. The lantern flickered, threatening to die. They reached a wider chamber, and Clay's eyes widened at what lay before them. A collapsed wall revealed a hidden shaft, long sealed, its timbers broken and rotting. Inside were faint impressions of bodies, the shapes pressed against the earth. He looked at the girl, whose eyes were wide but unwavering. She pointed to one shape in particular, closer to the center, a body or what remained of one. Li Wen's husband, he realized, the man whose life had been stolen and hidden by greed and silence. Clay's stomach churned. "We need to get help," he said, though even as he spoke he knew the town wouldn't welcome this discovery. The overseer's allies were still alive, still guarding secrets, still capable of violence to maintain the lies. The girl didn't answer, but her hand rested on the earth, as if drawing strength from the ground itself. Another sound echoed, a faint, deliberate tapping from deeper in the mine. Clay froze. The girl's gaze sharpened. The tapping continued, rhythmic, purposeful, almost like a warning. Someone else was down there. Someone still alive? Or someone ensuring the secrets remained buried? Clay felt his pulse spike. The tension was unbearable. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the weight of the truth held him in place. The girl knelt closer to the hidden body, brushing away dust and debris with care, revealing more of the past than Clay could have imagined. The symbols, the maps, the writings, they all pointed to a network of lies, cover-ups, and silent suffering. Outside, the wind howled through the ridge, rattling the wooden supports of the mine and shaking loose debris. Clay looked at the girl. Her face was pale, but her eyes held determination. He realized that she was more than just a witness. She was a guide, a living connection to the history everyone else had tried to erase. A sudden noise, a low guttural sound, came from the far end of the chamber. Clay froze, gun raised. The girl's hand pressed against his arm, signaling him to stay calm. The sound grew louder, echoing off the stone, like a warning, a growl, a whisper of the past demanding attention. Clay swallowed hard. He knew they were close to something monumental, something the town would fight to suppress. And yet, the girl's silent insistence, her unwavering courage, pulled him forward. They were on the edge of uncovering the truth, standing at the very threshold where past and present collided. The mine seemed to breathe around them, alive with secrets, warnings, and ghosts of those who had been silenced. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper of the wind heightened the tension, making Clay's pulse race. The girl pointed again, toward a narrow tunnel leading even deeper. Clay took a breath, understanding that what lay ahead could change everything. But also knowing the danger was far from over, he glanced at her one last time. Her eyes, silent but speaking volumes, told him she was ready. And with that, they stepped into the darkness together, toward the heart of the mine, toward the truth that had been buried for decades, and toward a confrontation the town had never expected. The air grew heavier, the shadows thicker, and every step forward was a step closer to the secrets that could ignite a storm no one in Willow Bend could ignore. And in that quiet, tense moment, Clay realized that the climax was not just approaching. It was already breathing down their necks, waiting to reveal what had been hidden for so long. Clay felt the damp air press against him as he stepped further into the narrow tunnel, the lantern trembling in his hand. The girl led the way, her bare feet sure and light despite the debris underfoot. Every sound, the drip of water from the ceiling, the soft creak of timber, the low groan of the mine, made him tense, but he pressed on, trusting her. She had carried this burden in silence for years. Now he realized she needed him to witness it, to help give it a voice. They reached a small chamber, just beyond the collapsed shaft they had first seen. In the lantern's glow, Clay could see the outlines of more remains, long hidden beneath dust, rocks, and timbers. The girl knelt beside them, brushing away the soil with care. Among the shadows, he recognized shapes of tools, a miner's helmet, and a piece of cloth that matched the uniform style of her father's time. She had found the exact spot her father had been buried, a place deliberately concealed to hide the truth. Clay set the lantern down and knelt beside her. He pulled out the leather-bound journal and began reading aloud the entries he hadn't fully absorbed before. Warnings her father had written, records of dangerous conditions, pleas for justice that had gone unanswered. The girl watched silently, her fingers tracing the edge of the hidden timber. He felt her presence steady him, give him courage. This was more than uncovering old bones. This was setting the record straight for those who had been silenced. Outside, The wind carried a faint echo, as if the hills themselves were listening. The girl's hand hovered over his arm, urging him to keep going. Clay took a deep breath. "We can't leave them here," he said. "The town needs to know." The journey back to Willow Bend was quiet, but charged with purpose. Clay carried the remains he could move, carefully wrapped, while the girl followed, guiding him along secret paths only she knew. As they emerged near the outskirts of town, the first rays of sun were breaking over the horizon, casting gold over the ridge and making the shadows of the hills long and stark. At the town square, Clay found the sheriff, who had grown increasingly wary of his comings and goings. The moment the sheriff saw the girl and the packages Clay carried, he stiffened. "Turner, what in the—" Clay didn't answer immediately. He pulled the first bundle from the wagon and laid it on the table, revealing the documents, the journal, and some of the artifacts from the mine. Then he opened the last bundle, revealing the bones that had been hidden for decades. The townspeople who had gathered at the square gasped, some stepping back, some leaning forward in disbelief. The girl stood silently beside him, holding the lantern and staring at the crowd with steady, unwavering eyes. The sheriff's face paled. "You can't be serious, Turner. This changes everything." "I'm serious," Clay said. "This is the truth. Lee Wen, his family, the miners, they didn't die by accident. The company covered it up, and the town's been living with that lie ever since. But it ends today." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some tried to look away, unwilling to face what they had ignored for years. Others whispered apologies, guilt creeping into their voices. Mrs. Riley was there too, clutching her shawl, tears in her eyes. "It's all true," she said quietly. "I knew, and I stayed silent. We all did." The girl stepped forward, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "He did not die alone. He did not deserve this, and no one else should be silenced again." A hush fell over the crowd. Her words, spoken after years of silence, carried a weight that no one could ignore. Clay felt a shiver run down his spine. This moment was bigger than both of them. It was justice, long delayed, finally finding its way to the light. The townspeople began to ask questions slowly, hesitantly. Clay read aloud from the journal and the letters, showing the records, the evidence of bribes, threats, and falsified reports. As the day went on, the town had to confront the truth of the overseer's actions and the deliberate cover-up of the mine's collapse. Families learned names of ancestors they had never spoken of. The girl's silence had protected her until now, but her voice had brought clarity. Meanwhile, the sheriff, though reluctant, began taking notes, preparing a report that would finally acknowledge what had been ignored for decades. Clay stayed close to the girl, watching her carefully. Though she had spoken, she seemed to relax only a fraction, as if a great weight had lifted but left the burden of memories behind. The overseer's legacy, long praised in the town, was now being questioned. Statues, plaques, and memorials that had celebrated his role in the mine were re-examined. People who had turned a blind eye began to face their own complicity. And for the first time, Willow Bend began to understand that the foundation of their town had been built on lies and silence. As evening fell, Clay and the girl returned to the Chang property. May, the widow, was waiting, eyes red from crying but filled with a fragile kind of peace. She reached for her daughter, and the girl leaned into her embrace, silent once more but in a way that spoke of relief and connection. Clay watched them, realizing the strength it had taken to endure years of pain in silence, and the courage it took to finally reveal the truth. The town didn't change overnight, but the first steps had been taken. People began to speak openly about the mine, the families affected, and the lies that had been hidden. The girl's act of courage had given them permission to acknowledge what they had long denied. Clay knew it would take time and there would be resistance, but the momentum of truth could not be stopped. In the weeks that followed, Clay and the girl worked together to document everything: maps, journals, letters, photographs, and artifacts. The town slowly came to terms with the story of Lee Wen and the other miners. Memorials were erected where the bodies had been found, and a small ceremony honored those who had been silenced for decades. May stood beside her daughter, her eyes reflecting pride and sorrow, knowing that her family's suffering had finally been recognized. Clay often rode out to the ridge overlooking the mine, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The girl would accompany him sometimes, silent but attentive, watching the sun set over the hills and the plains stretching endlessly beyond. He realized that her voice, once thought lost, had always been present in her actions, her choices, and her resilience. Speaking had been a final step, a bridge between the past and the present, and now the town could no longer ignore the consequences of its silence. The conflict that had threatened to tear Willow Bend apart had resolved not through anger or revenge, but through courage, truth, and the willingness to face uncomfortable realities. The girl's voice, finally heard, had exposed lies, brought justice, and allowed the living to remember those who had been lost. Clay knew that silence had been both a shield and a weapon, and that understanding it had been the key to uncovering the past. In the end, Willow Bend began to heal. The town acknowledged its mistakes, families reconciled with histories they had buried, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier, freed from the weight of unspoken truths. Clay watched the girl one afternoon as she tended the small garden behind the farmhouse, her hands shaping the earth with care. He understood that life, much like the land, could recover if given attention and honesty. The girl never spoke much again, but her presence, her courage, and the truth she carried left a lasting impression. The town no longer whispered about curses or secrets. Instead, they remembered courage, resilience, and the power of facing what had been hidden. Clay often thought about how one person's silence could carry so much weight, and how one voice, when finally spoken, could shift the course of an entire community. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Clay Turner felt a quiet satisfaction. The Chinese widow's daughter, silent for so many years, had not only revealed her father's story, but had changed the town forever. And in her silence, once thought a void, he had discovered the deepest kind of truth, one that needed no words to resonate. The wind carried a calm through Willow Bend that evening, a soft, steady promise that history had been acknowledged and that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Clay looked at the girl, and for the first time he saw her smile. A small, quiet curl of lips that spoke of relief, courage, and a future no longer haunted by the shadows of the past. The mine, the town, and the families affected had been given a chance to breathe, to remember, and to honor the lost. And for Clay, standing beside the girl, it was a reminder that courage, even in the quietest form, could change everything. Willow Bend would never forget, and neither would he.